Mike Lindberg, our speaker today, is well known to this audience. He's been president of the Oregon Symphony Foundation since January of this year. Mike was born in Portland. He tells me he left almost immediately for Astoria, where he grew up, and he graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in economics in 1964. He had lots of experience in city government, amongst other things, worked in Neil Goldschmidt's administration during some of the early developmental days in the city. And from 1979 until 1996, he was an effective and greatly admired Portland City Commissioner. During those 17 years, something he describes as a wonderful Broadway run, he was a regional and national champion for Portland. He helped lead us through natural disasters like the Mount St. Helens eruption, and along the way, he helped organize and create our own 9/11 emergency response system. He led the drive to save Pioneer Square. He has constantly supported human rights and civil liberties issues. One of his many responsibilities while he was a city commissioner included the Arts Commission, which seemed to especially capture his passion. Most of us remember his last City Club address, when he placed wonderful paintings done by Portland school children on the chairs all around the room. This was in an effort to help remind us how the study of the arts disciplines the mind and prepares it for additional enterprises. I took as many of those as I could capture, photographed them, and use them now as inserts between presentations that I give about skin disease. In his new position as president of the Oregon Symphony, Mike is uniquely placed to talk with us today about the power of the arts in Portland. Please welcome ex-Commissioner Lindberg, now President Lindberg. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much, Francis. I was thinking about all the people calling me this morning about OPB and comparing that to the eruption of Mount St. Helens or something like that. I was feeling I wanted to thank you, and again, it's an honor to come back to the City Club. And each time that I have a chance to speak here, I look at it as sort of preparing a meal, and you kind of want to change the recipe a little bit. And this time, usually I just sit down, I think, I read, I write, and then I speak. This time I added a dash of something new to the recipe, and that was a little more listening. And in quest for some fresh angles and perspectives, I made a foray out into the arts community and visited with a whole series of people. Many of you are here today, so if you hear your ideas coming back, it's not plagiarism. I was just a good listener. I listened to people like Christy Edmonds, Bill Crane, and there I heard a lot about OPB. And it did kind of remind me, actually, in February of last year, my last speech to the City Club, my farewell speech. During the 6 months after that, I probably had literally 200 people come up to me and say, boy, I just love that City Club speech. That was really great. And I said, I didn't see you there. And I said, well, I was listening live because it had become part of their habit and tradition. And I had about 5 people call me this morning and say, can't make it, but I'll be listening to you on the radio. So we do know how popular that it is. But in addition to these people, I also listened to Julie Mancini, Tony Beadle, Tad Savinar, Harriet Sherburne, Joe D'Alessandro, Dennis Bigelow, Kathleen Johnson-Kuhn, Bill Flood, Bill Bulick, Chris Darcy, Donna Mulroney, Vicki Poppin. And of course, as we had these conversations, sometime we might have maybe a drink after work, so then the waiter or the bartender would come over and say, oh, I heard what you were talking about. Maybe like the woman at the Benson that moved here from Australia, and she said, we're jolly damn good, and I hope you guys appreciate it. We don't realize what we've got here, talking about the state of the arts. Well, I didn't think the City Club needed in this speech today the same old state-of-the-art speech that focused only on the grim statistics, which we already know so well. We know that the U.S. is near the bottom of most industrialized countries in terms of government funding for the arts. We know that Oregon is 48th out of 50 states in terms of government funding, that Portland's probably in the bottom third of all cities, that Oregon, which ranks 23rd in income, is now 41st in philanthropic giving, that probably only about 1% of all businesses give to the arts. Because communicating those statistics, as powerful as they are, or we think they are, doing that alone to our citizens and politicians clearly is not working as a tool for progress. The reaction of so many people is, so what? Or we can get it done in Oregon in another more innovative and entrepreneurial way. In fact, remember that tourism slogan, things look different here, that we don't really need government funding to make it work. Today, what I'm going to do is to try to lift us to higher levels. I'm going to plant some seeds or throw them to the wind, tell some success stories, suggest some observations or some messages based on observations I've had that I think could take us to the next level. Since there's so much focus on a lack of government funding, I did, though, ask a number of people, what is it about our culture and our country really that has led to that? And I believe that it's because we're such a young country, a grand experiment, and we developed our country as pioneers, and we always have our eyes on the horizon in front of us and youth and pop culture, rather than the horizon behind us with the tradition of the value of the fine arts and historic preservation. And D.H. Lawrence may have said it best, and I think it's important to get clues, if you're working in the arts or anything in Portland, about our pioneer ancestry. And he talked about what it took to tame the West. Americans, D.H. Lawrence said, will not stand for the pioneer stuff except in small sentimental doses. They know too well the grimness of it, the savage sight and savage failures which broke the back of the country, but which also broke something in the human soul. The spirit and the will survive, but something in the soul perished, the softness, the floweriness, the natural tenderness. How could it survive the sheer brutality of the fight with that American wilderness, which is so big, vast, and obdurate? The savage America was conquered and subdued at the expense of intuitive sympathy of the human soul. The fight was too brutal. Well, I sometimes think when we're fighting for things in Oregon, education or the arts, there's a feeling if it isn't painful, it isn't valid. And then sometimes I feel we have to prove ourselves, like we have to lie down, have a bullet removed without anesthetic, put a piece of wood between our jaws, and then people will give us a little money and say, okay, you deserved it. It's just that old West feeling we have here. Well, how do we transcend the statistics then? First is the power of storytelling. Most of you already know that the Oregon Arts Commission received $450,000 more in their budget in the waning days of the legislature. Why? Not because of these statistics, but because of the power of storytelling, where a few legislators reacted to the stories about how the arts help rescue the lives of troubled kids with special needs. And so I thought, well, I had my own kind of story of what led up to what I would include in this speech. And while sitting alone at midnight just a couple weeks ago on the edge of the Deschutes River, looking at a trillion stars, listening to otters splashing, ducks plunking, geese honking, started thinking about all the connections to the world around us. And some of the things I thought about, Harvard University biologists estimating that 100 species a day are disappearing. Global dissolution of pollutants worldwide so much that breast milk that is now tested in many cities in the United States has 200 trace chemicals that aren't supposed to be there. The United Nations appointing 1,000 top scientists who conclude that global warming is occurring and predict a 2-degree increase in temperatures in the next 50 years with devastating results. And then looking up at the sky, I saw satellites blinking. I was thinking about all the technology. Probably one of those was direct TV, 500 channels into every home, maybe to see programs about how those species were disappearing. Military satellites that are now so precise to see from the air if a man is bald or has hair. And the thought of a Pathfinder on Mars, a little remote-controlled car running around taking pictures. And then I thought, it's a funny world out there, but what the hell does this have to do with the arts? And this speech that I have to give, I was enjoying my thought process very much. But what I then concluded that everything is connected to everything else. And the more art makes those connections and is integrated into what is meaningful in our life, the more powerful that art becomes. Two, that the arts are an ecological system in our own community. There's an ecology of artists and arts groups and building audiences and developing talent. And obviously the health of the arts is an inseparable part of the overall ecological health of our community. Three, looking at the skies that night, I thought about the arts being about the search and the exploration and the mystery of the unknown, the desire to discover And then I thought about that Pathfinder up there. As a matter of fact, talk about human curiosity. In one day after that landed on Mars, there were 45 million hits on their webpage. And in 1 month, there were 545 million hits on that webpage, which broke all records, really talking about the importance of human curiosity and the search for knowledge. And that both in the space program and working in the arts, what we're really talking about are building bigger brains. 4, looking at the sky, I thought of James DePriest's definition of music. Music, he said, is composed of vanishing particles of sound, made coherent by memory and expectation. It is worth far more than it costs, and it pays dividends that are infinite. What a deal, what a deal. And 5, again thinking of connections, of how arts thrive when they deepen their links to the community, I thought about the recent article about the Symphony in Milwaukee that had a smashing artistic success by leading a citywide celebration of the Central American rainforests, and how they had concerts of the songs of the rainforest and presented compositions by Central American composers, had slideshows, educational programs, and it was a smash hit commercially also. 6, as I looked out at the sky and that river, I thought about how the arts are often pushing against the river of popular culture to compete for time and entertainment dollars in a society that seems to have an affection for bad news. A New Yorker article recently said if you were a European reading about the US, you would think we were made up entirely of celebrities and serial killers. From 1990 to 97, the coverage of homicides on TV news increased by 700%, while the crime rate went down for homicides. Our popular culture demands blockbusters. It responds to marketing more than content. And 7, my last thought, finally. Sitting alone, I thought about how this speech reminded me of a quote by Shakespeare, because I had to get into the speech about the state of the arts. When we mean to build, we first survey the plot. And I thought about taking a picture from above and seeing everything that's going on and how it is today in the arts versus 5, 10, or 20 years ago, because that's really the only way you could talk about the state of the arts. So are there trends among the chaos? Have we actually blossomed with more living artistic organisms sprouting up while we're agonizing over squabbles about the NEA? And it did remind me of one of my most memorable experiences in public office in about 1990. I met the chief photographer for NASA, who had been doing this for like 20 years, and they took 1 million pictures from space. And I thought, boy, there's a person to invite over to your house to give you a slideshow. That would be good. And he kept all these and put them into a presentation sequentially so he could see the trends of what was happening with the world environment. And it turned him into a rabid environmentalist because he saw the deforestation of Africa, the pollution of the seas. But we don't have these aerial surveys of the arts world, and it's not a statistical bar chart world. And sometimes when we're looking for the answer, sort of the one secret answer to arts funding or what we ought to do next, it almost contradicts what the arts are about. In fact, William Burroughs, writer and poet who died in August of this year, kept a diary during his last few months, and he started thinking about this desire that we have to find the secret answer to everything. And he asked a physicist, do you really want to know the secret of the universe? And the physicist said yes. Burroughs thought a fraction of that secret would have you climbing the walls, and he only wanted to know what I needed to know to do what I need to do. And in fact, he said, do you really want to know the secret? Hell no, all is in the not done. And I thought that was such an interesting statement of what the arts are about. It's all the unexpected and the unknown that comes before us that makes it so stimulating. So what I wanted to do in the remaining time I have is tell some success stories, because if you were my friend from NASA taking those pictures from on high and it was the Portland art scene, what would you see in a trend over 20 years? Very strong management. Ticket sales generating higher percentage of budgets than any other city in the United States. Innovation and risk-taking, volunteerism and increasingly strong boards, an increased variety and complexity of program offerings. And in fact, in contrast to what he was seeing in that world environment of that deterioration, he would have seen a tremendous growth, but part of the arts, of course, there's no plateau, we're never really satisfied, and so we keep on moving. But then if that NASA person sort of landed in Portland and took out that little remote car and started going around and looking at things, he would see some specific success stories which are really extraordinary. One, where I work myself, a 102-year-old symphony, longest tenured symphony west of the Mississippi, but still doing programs like The Spirit of Terezin, playing pieces this fall composed by Jewish composers in a concentration camp, demonstrating the incomparable strength of the human spirit. Talk about connecting the arts to our life. He would see this weekend the 10-year anniversary of the architecturally award-winning Performing Arts Center, now financially sound. They would see the art museum's bold, risk-taking, successful fundraising ventures and exhibits that are literally drawing hundreds of thousands. They would see the explosive energy of the Portland Institute for Contemporary Arts, engaging these new audiences with art on the edge programming. And they would see a gallery scene that many people now think, in terms of being accessible and being able to walk around and visit, is probably just about as good as any in the United States. That little remote pathfinder would also see Portland Repertory Theater, the Young Playwrights program, where 40 high school kids actually wrote plays this last year. They're then judged, and PRT actually puts on one of these plays. They see the development of RAC, considered now a model for a regional arts agency, and getting incredible funding coming in for pilot programs like Youth at Risk because it's such a leader. They would see the spectacular reinvigoration of the Business Committee for the Arts, the success of Arts and Lectures, where writers like Philip Roth and others say they speak to the largest audiences in their careers. Their minds are blown away. There's no other comparable program in the United States, but we really don't think about it that way. They would see the programs for Youth at Risk, where kids in the juvenile justice system are making videos about ballot measure 11, or former gang members are doing photo exhibits called Shooting Straight. Or maybe the couple paintings in my living room by kids from SEI, where an artist is funded to teach kids to paint and really paint well. Or the Northwest Children's Theater and Oregon Children's Theater, involving tens of thousands of kids. Or the probably 250,000 kids in our region, which actually are brought down to arts events, or artists goes to their schools. And that is kind of an estimate of how many people we're reaching at this point in time. Or they might see Little Huddle's extraordinary risk-taking leadership at center stage, or all the smaller theaters just popping up like summer daisies. Or the public art on light rail, or at the convention center. Or the ballet in the park, or the symphony playing this last week to 15,000 people at a free concert in the waterfront. So that NASA photographer taking those close-ups would see success stories which nationally are looked at as models, but which sometimes we probably take for granted. And yes, our facilities are bursting, and we need 15 more community music centers, and schools are cutting music education, and arts groups have deficits. And sometimes it's hard to work in Oregon, to be proud of a place where at Lincoln High School there are 46 kids now in an algebra class. But what do we do about it? That's the question. How do we take the steps to the next level? And so I have 10 quick observations and suggestions. The first is, don't give up on more government funding. Although let's not spend 80% of our time on it. I know one idea that actually would work, and that is if at every ticket line and lobby we had a video poker machine or slot machine, we would get the same amount of money. Now every tavern that has video poker is averaging $70,000 a year just on that one source of income. But there's an old story about kind of working on government funding for the arts. It's the one about Thomas Edison, who failed 1,000 times before he invented the light bulb. But he said, I didn't fail 1,000 times. The light bulb was an invention that required 1,001 steps. And sometime I think we've looked at this government funding thing as being able to solve it in 3 years or 5 or 10, and that just isn't the way it is. Second, I think that we should achieve more government funding through the power of storytelling rather than presenting the grim statistics. Convert officials to art zealots one by one by getting them engaged in these stories. 3, recognize that our greatest story to tell is the role of arts education to transform kids' lives, and we know the facts. In one study from 1990 to 94, students with 4 years of arts training scored 53 points higher in SAT scores verbal, 35 points higher in math. We know that recent studies at the University of California at Irvine that music lessons at a young age wire kids' brains to permanently develop a much greater capacity in all fields of endeavors. We know that the Oregon School Reform Act requires arts curriculum and instruction in place by 2001 and 2 to all students in the state of Oregon. This may be a shock to folks, but I say it's the law. You better buckle up and get ready for it. Few people know that that law actually requires students to be able to demonstrate proficiency in the arts, including creating, performing, or presenting art, recognizing artistic works of art, and understanding the historical and cultural context of it. And lastly, in regards to education, we have to go beyond the feeling of what's the law and what our moral responsibilities are. And it reminds me of a short poem read on the U.S. Senate floor by a senator about during the NEA debate. Remember that Chicanito flunking math and English. He's the Picasso of your Western states, but he will die with 1,000 masterpieces hanging only from his mind. My fourth observation is we need to communicate more and form new partnerships based on the healing power of the arts. And let's start with music. There's a whole cadre of music therapy teachers and researchers working throughout the U.S. today, and there's been a lot of anecdotes in the past, but now there's a major project involving the professors of music and professors of biology at 6 research universities. So they're done with a fair amount of their work, and what are they finding? Actually, with getting people to listen to music and play instruments, whether they're even good at it or not, they show major changes in viruses receding, changes in blood chemistry. At University of Miami, they've been working with Alzheimer's patients at a vet's hospital who listened and played music for 6 weeks and had a 250% increase in growth hormone, serotonin up 400%. So music does work in terms of its healing powers. And on October 1st, there will be a book coming out called The Mozart Effect by Don Campbell, which will document how it improves memory, expedites recovery during physical therapy, and a whole series of things that we can use to form new partnerships in terms of advancing the arts here. Fifth, my observation about continue to see the arts as an industry. First, is a key part of our economy, and it's always so surprising. 3.2 million Americans now are working in cultural institutions. 1.7 million call themselves artists when they fill out the census forms. And then there's cultural tourism, of course, and its impact. But then we need, if we're going to look at it as an industry, to face honestly the fact of how undercapitalized that industry has been. And we know the capacity is here in our community to step up to the plate with an arts stabilization initiative. My sixth observation is that we must expand our horizons in terms of new types of partnerships. In Seattle, King FM, one of the nation's most successful classical music stations, has turned over $1 million to arts groups in the last few years by forming into a partnership with a large radio conglomerate, which is actually a commercial profit-making venture, and they do advertising. But that partnership, which was really launched by the Bullets that owned that radio station, has really been successful. And there are new synergies at home, with PICA locating in the new Wieden and Kennedy headquarters, not just as a gift to the arts, but because both institutions realize that creativity can be enhanced in both institutions, and what more potential there is for that here. In my seventh observation, the arts must look beyond government funding and take a fresh approach to private philanthropy. There's no reason that we can't do as well as universities and hospitals and churches, which in Oregon alone have brought in several $100 million just since 1990. This struck home to me so much after we'd worked so hard, and with the help of so many other people in this room, and Commissioner Kafori, who now works with the arts I see out here. We'd worked to get hundreds of thousands added to the city budget, but just one day recently, one family suddenly gave $600,000 to the new Dornbecker Children's Hospital to incorporate public art in the facility, and they sent a letter along saying they really knew about the power, the healing power of the arts. So what they did in one day and decided to do from one family, it took us several years to do. And my own alma mater, University of Oregon, raising $170 million in the last several years. And you kind of think about it then. People give to education because they're kind of looking at the past. They give to the church, to the hospitals, because they're thinking about something that's been done well for them, or they might be used in the future. And they give to church, perhaps they're thinking of the afterlife, maybe an insurance policy or something like that. But if you think about education, hospitals, and churches, and then the arts, education has to do with the mind, hospitals frequently with the heart, churches with the soul. You know, what better instrument than the arts to deal all with mind, heart, and soul? So we ought to be able to do just as well in fundraising, I think. So. In terms of philanthropy, listen to this quote from Patsy Bullitt Collins of the Seattle Bullitt family. She said, "Sometimes people say to me, why give money to the community instead of to your kids? Well, my kids are secure enough. They don't have to have everything. I want to give them a community worth living in, a cultural place to be." Well, I believe there are more Bullets in Portland, not the kind in drive-by shootings. There are Bullitt families here, if we can find them. We must understand in a more sophisticated way why people give. The 7 Faces of Philanthropy, a survey showed that 26% give because it's good for the community and their own businesses, 11% because of social benefits, 21% for religious reasons, 8% to continue a family dynasty, and so on, 15% because of tax breaks. And we must analyze all of our supporters and donors because, as somebody mentioned to me recently, there are 32,000 millionaires now in the Portland metropolitan area because of real estate and stock values going up. And the library got a call the other day and got a $1 million donation from somebody they'd never heard of before, who passed away and didn't have children and just was a regular library user, and it added $1 million in one day to their foundation. My 8th observation, there's only 10, remember, as the Oregon Arts Commission is doing so well, we need to communicate more specifically and dramatically that arts build community, whether it's helping to redevelop a neighborhood like the Pearl District and the art galleries are doing, or historic preservation of theaters like the Hollywood or the Elsinore in Salem. Arts build community by providing after-school programs, strengthening families, teaching communities more about ethnic populations, providing community gathering places, getting people away from the internet and TV and actually having them celebrate together and get to know each other. In my 9th observation, the arts need not just more leaders, but a more diverse, diffused group, taking risks, being bold, speaking out, not the kind where we add more process and meetings and run around in circles. And that remind me about a true story about somebody who was running, a county commissioner running for mayor of the town recently. In a town meeting, he said, if elected, I'm going to turn this town around 360 degrees. So not, again, running around in circles, but we need to rethink our attitudes of leadership as we approach the new millennium. A good friend of mine, Harlan Cleveland, who I met on a national board that I'm on, has been president of a couple universities, former ambassador to NATO, recently spoke at a leadership forum at the United Nations International Academy in Jordan. And here's what he said, and I think there's such a different view of what we think about in terms of the solid, staid, plugging along leadership sometime in Portland. What is required? First, a lively intellectual curiosity and interest in everything, because everything really is related to everything else, and therefore to what you're doing, whatever it is. Second, a genuine interest in what other people think and why they think that way, which means you have to be at peace with yourself for a start. Third, a feeling of special responsibility for envisioning a future that's different from a straight-line projection of the present. Fourth, a hunch that most risks are there not to be avoided but to be taken. Fifth, a mindset that crises are normal, tensions can be promising, and complexity is fun, and that we need to be reminded of again. Sixth, a realization that paranoia and self-pity are reserved for people who don't want to be leaders. Seventh, a sense of personal responsibility for the outcome of our efforts. Eighth, a quality that he calls unwarranted optimism, the conviction that there must be some more upbeat outcome that would result from adding up all of the available resources and advice that we have. And 10th, the last observation, actually this is my 10th, that's the end of his quote on leadership. But it was interesting. Harlan is just a fascinating person who has taught me a lot through his work in the environment. And my last observation is about our crusade to tell people about how arts is an integrating factor in our life. And I'm going to tell just one story, and that's about one of the RAC Arts in the Schools program and how it works to integrate or connect. And this is at McKay Elementary School in Beaverton. They chose to involve all students in the school and all parents in a textile project. But first they brought sheep to school, and then they heard a speech by a sheep herder. And then they learned about sheepdogs, and they had some sheepdogs come and learned how they were trained. And then they saw wool shearing in action, and then they learned spinning wool, and then they did weaving, and then they kept a journal about the whole experience. Through that one art project, the kids learned reading and writing and some math, learned history and culture, learned a motor skill that required focus and discipline, became artists and created a product, and felt good about themselves. What a deal the arts can be in terms of investment. In closing, here's why I'm so exuberant about the state of the arts and am filled with, it may be unwarranted optimism, but that's my nature. Because the city itself is a place that values irreverence, it's lively, dynamic, playful. We value curiosity, and Portland loves cognitive leaps, connections, and partnerships. because we could be the creative capital of the world with the resources and the brain power that we have here, not only in the arts, but in advertising, multimedia, high tech. Because we are better than we know right now, but we just can't keep track of it. There's so many things happening. Reminds me of the Mario Andretti, the race car driver, his school of change. If everything is under control, you're going too slow. And lastly, because in this world of bombardment from the waves of popular culture, the arts are the major pathway to understanding the purpose of our lives and establishing our own identity. So as we leave here today, we must remember that we control our own destiny. Enthusiasm is no small ingredient in that recipe. Poet Ted Loder complained about the cliche greeting we hear around us at every turn, and he wrote a poem about it. I'm sick of a string of have a nice days. What I want is blessed days, wondrous days, exciting days, surprising days. So the next time somebody comes up to you in an elevator and says, have a nice day, try giving this offbeat reply. Thank you, but I have other plans.
Mike, thank you for that wonderful speech. You have the honor of giving the first question here. So my question, Mike, is what impact do you believe this will have on the symphony and other parts of the arts community?
Well, as I was talking about Mount St. Helens going off, I probably have had more, I had 5 people come up to me before this and said, I'm going to ask you a question about OPB. I already gave my opinion about the City Club. And this is the central forum in the state of Oregon. This is where U.S. Senate races were decided, mayors were chosen, and to me, people have developed a tradition, really, over a long period of time, is it's Friday noon, and like people called me at work today and said, well, I can't quite make it, but I'll listen to you. So I wish that decision would be, and hope it would be reconsidered. In terms of the music, I'm going to talk from a personal standpoint in that I like the music and I think that it's tragic and very disappointing, but then what we need to do is to try to hopefully reverse that decision, but then move on from there and see if there isn't another way to achieve the same thing with other stations if that decision can't be reversed. And I would say, frankly, that I think one of the most disappointing parts about it actually was the process. There's sort of a way of doing things in Portland and in Oregon that involves a dialogue, and we don't get recognition and awards for being a model of citizen participation for no reason at all, and that is people really expect here to have an impact on the decisions that affect their life. And I think what was so disappointing about that particular decision is that there was no dialogue with the listeners, the public, the contributors over a long period of time.
Leslie Toomey, City Club member, co-chair of the Arts and Culture Committee. Mike, as you were talking about unwarranted optimism, I started envisioning Alan Greenspan, and I'm going to go home and check the stocks and see if they don't fall because of that statement. But if your dreams of unwarranted optimism should be realized, how do you see the Portland art scene changing in 10 years hence? How would it look different from today?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to have to take a minute to think of a good answer to it. I think, again, if you stood back, as I was talking about that NASA picture of the globe with global environment and the art scene, since we have had that explosion in terms of what is offered, and we have so much diversity, one of the things I say, how would I like it to change, is when I gave a picture of the things that were missing from it, I'd call there's that flashing yellow lights that are warning. One, I would like to see just a tremendous increase in arts education in the school system, which is declining. The second thing is that I would like to see the implementation of the arts stabilization program in some form, because I frankly think in so many arts organizations, and now that I've moved through the looking glass and I'm struggling in the nonprofit world, I can really see how it is. Too much time is spent just sort of scrambling day to day. How are we going to balance that budget this year? Not enough time is spent figuring out how are we going to solve that problem with arts education, do more outreach for youth, have more artistic risk and new programming. So I would say those are the two main things that come to my mind. But I would say also that we're going to have to deal with, in the tremendous growth in our population, we're not really getting those people as much in terms of audiences. So we're going to have to figure out how we get out to the whole high-tech community, the growth in the suburbs, whether this is going to be through technology. And personally, I like the idea of people gathering and celebrating together, because there's nothing like that experience. And there wasn't for me, I know, last week, but to be all together and have several thousand people hear Beethoven's Ninth, rather than all plugging into the internet at the same time or something like that. So I think those would be the three things.
Mike, I'm Bill Crane, a City Club member, and Arnold and I, though we're good friends, did not consult on our questions, but I hope if you'll forgive me if I ask another OPB one. I'd like to ask you to wear two hats simultaneously to answer this. First, your new hat of being a steward of contributed dollars to help our beloved Symphony be more successful. And second, your old hat as steward of the common good as a former public servant. This is the question. Why in the world does Oregon Public Broadcasting, which in its becoming a private corporation in '93, which they asked the legislature to let them become, was given $6.5 million in public capital assets in their building and equipment from the state, who continue to get around $3.5 million appropriation per biennium from the general fund, and who seek thousands and thousands of private dollars in contributions? Why do they have the right to shirk what many of us see as 50% of their responsibility, which is cultural programming, and suggest that that be taken over by other stations, and yet not talk about dispersing assets so that those stations could become capable of doing that? I know you don't represent OPB, but as what I've always thought is the most distinguished public servant, I'd like to ask this question. Isn't there something funny going on here with the public trust?
Well, that was, Bill, that was just a tremendous question asked to the wrong person, as you suggested. And I've already given, my own views, but personally, since I love to listen to music and performance today, everybody has their own opinions on it, the different needs that they have, and I talked about the process, my own feelings. And I personally have an incredible number of options in terms of talk and talking heads and 500 channels on TV and these types of things. And so personally, I think there was a letter to the editor today that referred to the loss of music as not being bad because it's non-intellectual. It really, and I don't know if people saw that letter, but I think actually that, first of all, music is an intellectual pursuit. The reflection and meditative qualities, the healing qualities that we've talked about, the connections that it has with all these other things that are going on in our lives, that perhaps we need to take a fresh look at the role of music in our life and not look at it as something that's isolated and disconnected. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nancy Kirkinen, City Club member. I asked this question on behalf of some of the most creative and enthusiastic artists in our community. You mentioned William Burroughs' notion that all is in the unknown, and this quotation's relevant connection to the arts. Knowing that a community of artists thrive on the innovations of risk-taking, new work, and what is being done in the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art or at companies like Imago Theater, how do you recommend inspiring the growth of other innovative, less established organizations who may be the future contributors of new original work in Portland's future and in the future of our nation?
Okay. I think that when I made reference to the smaller organizations that were popping up like daisies, first of all, a lot of this is happening, but there's no doubt in this particular area of the important role of government funding. And we heard in city council testimony they have in Congress, literally thousands of stories of the impact of that small amount of seed money, whether it's coming from the NEA or the Oregon Arts Commission or whether it's coming from the Regional Arts Commission. The reason I said we shouldn't give up on government funding is that $5,000, $10,000, $50,000 can be just an incredible catalyst and starting place for a lot of the smaller organizations. And I would say the second thing is we do need to look at more of the synergy of the partnerships and collaborations among the arts groups. We've made a great leap in 10 years, but I still believe that there's a lot that can be done in terms of those collaborations.
I'm Linda Peters, City Club member, chair of the Washington County Board of Commissioners, and we're in the process. I'm one of those public officials who is an arts zealot, and we're in the process of. Thank you. I agree there should be more of us. We're doing something in Washington County that I think is of interest to more than just Washington County and Hillsborough folks. It's going to be the first public sculpture garden in the state of Oregon. We're taking advantage of space in front of our new jail complex and adding to, yeah, isn't that great? We're adding to the money that the county had set aside for art, and instead of choosing one sculptor to provide us with one big sculpture to put in front of the new jail complex, we're going to have 4, but we're doing some fundraising from private citizens and businesses and so on, and we have our very first contribution, in fact, came from the Regional Arts and Culture Council, $10,000 toward being able to do this. My question is, as we try to connect within this region with art projects, I'd like you to comment on the possibilities for art projects and art and cultural tourism for helping us link up better one community with another, or one ethnic group with another, or one geographic area with another.
Yeah, and I think that, Linda, that's such a good point, because I still think a lot of the things are sort of isolated and disconnected. And first of all, that we don't have even a mechanism to know all the things that are going on. And if we don't know what's going on, you really can't provide the accessibility and do the proper marketing. And that we ought to look at when I talked about collaboration, even like in a few cities that I visited, where they sort of combine together, and every time you walk into a restaurant in the morning, you have like a daily news flash. So if you're in town or out of town, of everything that's going on that day and that week, and it's like a little newsletter that's put on your table. The other thing I think that is really true so much is that we really have to do much more, and I appreciate your leadership as a Washington County Commissioner. We have to face the reality that the resources and the wealth are throughout the region, but we are not really getting the contributions and from some of the governments, in spite of all the work that you've tried to do, and some of the private firms that are springing up throughout this region. And that in exchange for that contribution, though, we're going to have to be delivering services out there. And the neighborhood arts programs and actually taking art to the people is probably the best mechanism for doing that.
David Olson, City Club member.
Gee, I shouldn't have said all those things about cable, should I, really?
Absolutely. Mike, this probably relates to the OPB issue, but a number of other issues as well. Certainly, the commercial world and mass media are all about quantity and quantifying things, and arts is all about quality. And it's a tough road, certainly for arts organizations, to make the qualitative argument in a quantitative world. And I wonder what, in your work at the Symphony, how you bridge that gap. If you get 3 times as much of an audience at the Symphony for the Symphony playing with David Byrne of Talking Heads, and half that audience for a classical program, how is the Symphony walking that line, and what are your views on that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, since I'm with the Symphony Foundation, not really the best spokesperson as Don or Tony would be, for the Symphony itself. But I think because of the things that I talked about earlier in my speech, the fact that in our culture we've never really made that investment in the arts, one of the things that's happened with arts organizations, they've said, okay, to survive, what we really need to do is to maintain that quality classical program, but we need to add David Byrne and James Taylor and Bonnie Raitt, and I think we have 22 or 29 specials during the year, hopefully making the money to generate the revenue so that we can continue that classical program. And what you find is, like my experience at the Symphony, frankly, is when people say that it's well managed and it's lean by any standard, I think that's really true. Because there's that lack of infusion of that outside funding, people have to be much more entrepreneurial and much more creative, but there's only so far that you can take that. And so without really trying to come to a place where you become too commercial and you're trying to be everything to everybody rather than stick to your mission, or could dilute the quality. So I think it's really a good question, but it goes back to that infusion of the money, and I think James Dupree says money does mean music, And I talked about the government, but I talked about this incredible capacity in the private sector that's out there that I frankly don't think we've really tapped into in a very sophisticated way.
Lee Stevenson, City Club member, you've stated eloquently of the need for arts education, yet when we look at what decision makers are doing, they're not funding education or prioritizing it for the arts. And I think there's maybe a tendency of people to say, well, the arts can do it, but you've also observed correctly that the arts are really undercapitalized, and so the burden of education really can't be carried by them. How do we convince the decision makers to step up to the public responsibility to prioritize and fund arts education?
Well, first of all, I think what I talked about overall in terms of how well we do in persuading other people to put more money in investment in our future, that the statistics don't seem to be working, so we have to rely on the power of storytelling. Secondly, I think that we have to face the realities, and I've been out to a lot of schools and actually talked to principals, and the word comes down, okay, now you've got to cut 3 teachers this year, and they're talking about all those trade-offs and choices, that there's really a lack of adequate resources in the entire system. So that's why I mentioned in the speech, frankly, it included but somebody had told me about their child being in a class at Lincoln that had 46 kids in the algebra class. Because when we're fighting for that arts education, but that's the other reality we're dealing with, it makes our battle 10 times more difficult. So I think we need the next crusade, really, that has to do with the school reform to get that message out, to insist that that law be followed. And as was done in the other educational areas this last time fairly effectively at the legislature, take that to the next level.
I'm Don Sterling, City Club member. What's become of the Arts 2000 program?
Arts 2000, which I think was done in '92, had 72 action items and recommendations. And as I recall, the last time that we checked on that, it's probably getting up toward 60, do you think, the rack table there? I mean, we're probably at about 60 out of the 72 have either been fully implemented or are mostly implemented, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. And so I think that what we need to do, we were talking about surveying the landscape, is that we need to figure out, what's the next stage in arts planning? Because there are some things that are going unattended to, and we talked about arts education, and frankly, facilities is another one of them. And I know in visiting with Harriet recently, with all of our facilities there working at far over the capacity that they should, we're actually missing artistic opportunities that we should have because we don't have the facilities, and those need to be accessible with low rents. And so basically, I think that there should be another planning effort, but maybe rather than look at the entire scene, we ought to pick out the 3 or 4 major areas and really focus on them, and education and facilities and stabilization, and some others ought to be the ones that we would do, the next planning effort. But people ought to feel pretty darn proud here. And I talk about, say, we take national models for granted here. And when I was on the city council, I talked to the mayor, said, how many awards have we received for being like the best this or that? And so we started assembling the list, and we'd had something like 75 awards as the most livable community by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and so on and so on and so on. And sometime I wish that we would actually just sort of publish those in the paper so people could have some grasp, really, of just how the number of things that we've succeeded in doing here.
Tom Deering, City Club member. While we're talking with this emphasis on art education, Mike, how do we get the NASA photographer to notice that we have one of the major art colleges in Portland, and that is just emerging from 88 years of association with the Portland Art Museum to its independent status, and is in the process of locating itself in the Pearl District, and is a factor in our educating these people who will create the art that we all feed on.
The Pacific Northwest College of Art, of which I'm on the advisory council, and actually when I was talking about the success stories and that NASA photographer, and in one draft of my speech I'd included them, and somehow it dropped out because they've had in such an amazing role, and with their new building in the Pearl District, expect even greater things. And I think that one of the things that I found so fascinating just interviewing people preparing for the speech is the role of arts education, not just to produce arts, but what we need to do somehow in our society is have people who are working in these other high-tech industry, multimedia, advertising, other industries, recognizing if they can get that type of arts education, that what the people that come out of those, as they combine their energies with people in business, can produce things that are really extraordinary. So I'm glad you mentioned that particular school.
Jim Francisconi, City Club member. Mike, you talked about the many benefits of art, and you touched on it, but art as a strategy for violence reduction and the work that RAC has done with youth violence and that whole issue. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Right. First of all, Portland was picked out as one of 3 cities for the funding from the NEA and from the actual federal, I can't remember the name of the department, federal department. But basically, we've combined for the pilot programs because although we have a lot of anecdotes, and they're literally, I've got books this deep of all the success stories around the country in terms of what's happened, in terms of violence reduction, keeping kids out of trouble. They're more likely, if they have arts education, to finish high school, more likely to go on to college. A lot of that documentation is there. And I think there's a lot of people now that are finally grasping that and are willing to make that commitment. And frankly, that was the key thing that ended up in the legislature with the added funding this last time. It does remind me, though, that we're going to have to, Bill Strickland from Pittsburgh has spoken to the City Club before, and he has a program, an arts program for kids that get in trouble. And he was telling a story to me one time about George Bush coming visiting, wanted to give him an award for being one of the points of light. And he gracefully accepted the award, and he said, "George, as long as you're here, I'd like you to step outside. See that prison right over there?" He said, "I'm putting all these kids through this program right here, and here are the results we're having for $3,000 a year. And the other kids are over in there at $25,000 a year, and they're really not getting any better." So somehow we're going to have to make those connections in terms of this preventive power of the arts in a much more persuasive way.
Dick Lewis, City Club member. This is something of a fat pitch, perhaps, but for a number of years it seems to me that this culture has been very much preoccupied with the self, and that we've tended to value things in terms of what they do for each of us or for our own, in our own lives, and there hasn't been a much, at least I'm not aware of very much attention to the civic enterprise and the value, the larger kind of common good value in things. And you sort of touched here and there along that line, but would you tell us something of your thoughts on how experience of the arts is significant and important to the larger civic enterprise, the community itself, and how well people participate in it and function as citizens?
Mm-hmm. I think that first of all, one of the things, and in the last speech I gave the City Club, it was about civic responsibility and what citizenship means. And fortunately, there's a lot of different things, programs that are being initiated now, basically to start at a much earlier age, working actually with kids in schools, having to do with what the responsibilities and the obligations of citizenship in terms of looking out for the common good. But to specifically answer your question about the arts, I had mentioned, for example, I don't think people can be interested in the common good that much if they're totally disconnected from the society and the problems of the society. If you can just sort of drive home at night and use an go through a walled gate and use an electric garage door opener, turn on your home entertainment system. And so that one of the important roles, I believe, of the arts actually is to break down these structures and really introduce people to other ethnic populations, to really understand those cultures, to get people out into community gatherings, to celebrate together, to get to know each other. And so that's at least one, I think, element, the way that the arts can help citizenship. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike. All of us appreciate your zeal. We appreciate your rational optimism, and you do indeed give us a sense of confidence that our future in the arts in Portland is secure. We stand adjourned. Thank you for being here.